This is a first of a series of lessons on cellular respiration for intermediate level biology. When we talk about respiration in biology, the meaning of the word respiration used is different from the meaning for the word respiration as used by other people, by most people. When we talk about respiration, most people think of breathing, think of inhalation and exhalation. But when it comes to biology, especially when it comes to a certain level of biological studies, when we talk about respiration, what we are really referring to is cellular respiration, the process in which energy is derived from food. It's not breathing. So when it comes to breathing is inhaling and exhaling air. Ventilation is another word for breathing. But respiration is a very different process. It is a chemical process that occurs in cells, in which energy is extracted from food. The food that we usually quote in respiration is glucose. Now, it doesn't mean that respiration can only occur using glucose, but most food that we eat end up as being glucose after digestion. And although there can be respiration from sources of food other than glucose, we usually quote glucose as a general name for food in general. So the process of respiration, which in many cases uses oxygen, extracts energy from food, and in so doing, the glucose, the food, is broken down into carbon dioxide and water. Respiration can occur without oxygen, but during this lesson we will focus on processes that happen in aerobic respiration, that is, respiration using oxygen. Why does the cell need energy? There are many reasons why the cell needs energy. Every living process, every function performed by the cell requires energy. Protein synthesis, the production of proteins by cells, requires energy. DNA replication requires energy. Movement requires energy. When we talk about movement, think of muscle contraction or the movement of a flagellum. Cell division requires energy as well. The body on the whole, especially if it's the body of an endotherm, a warm-blooded organism, needs heat. And heat, of course, is a form of energy which also comes from respiration. Active transport is also an example of a process that requires energy, and is performed by cells. Let's focus on one single example of these uses of energy and go into some detail to see exactly how the energy is used and why. So let's take, for example, a cell. A cell with, of course, a cell membrane. All cells carry out active transport. And active transport is important for all sorts of metabolic processes that the cell performs. Active transport is also important for neurons to be able to carry nerve impulses. So let's imagine that this is a cell that is carrying active transport. Now, as you know, active transport is an energy requiring process in which particles go from a region of low concentration to a region of high concentration. Now let's say that we have this cell immersed in a solution of salts, in a sodium solution, in a solution containing sodium ions. Cells in general, body cells in general, push out sodium from their cytoplasm out into their surrounding fluids. They do so all the time by active transport. So let's take this cell. The cell needs to transport sodium ions from the cytoplasm to the outside. In order to do so, it cannot rely on diffusion, because diffusion would move particles to the inside of the cell, where there are few sodium particles. So in order to pump out sodium from the cytoplasm to the outside, an active transport pump must be used. An active transport pump is a membrane protein that uses energy in order to transport particles from a low concentration to a high concentration, or against their concentration gradient. The cell provides the energy for these pumps and indeed for all the other energy requiring processes from respiration. So without respiration, that pump wouldn't work. Without respiration, that pump wouldn't have any energy to carry out its job. Now, what kind of energy is given to that pump in order to pump the ions from the cytoplasm to the outside? What kind of molecule that carries energy goes and gives the energy to the pump? When we talk about energy being given to such proteins, for example, active transport pump and any other proteins in the cell that require energy, we should not think of glucose. Glucose is not the fuel for these cellular components to work. What the cell provides to these cellular components is chemical energy in the form of a molecule called ATP. ATP is the molecule that carries energy to all the body and cellular components that need energy. But ATP, where does it come from? Does it come from food? Do we drink ATP? No, ATP is a molecule produced by the body. It is produced by the body's cells using the energy derived from food. So food is in the picture, but food is not the molecule that provides ATP directly. ATP is produced by cells using energy from food. And that process is called respiration, the breakdown of food to release energy in order for that energy to be used to produce ATP. Then it's ATP which goes to all the cellular components that need energy. ATP is called an energy carrier molecule. It is an abbreviation for its name, adenosine triphosphate. It is considered the universal energy currency of life. When we say universal energy currency, we mean the molecule used for these energy requiring processes, not just by our body, but by all living things that we know of. So in order for a virus to replicate, it needs ATP. In order for a whale to move its tail, it needs ATP. In order for an elephant to do its marching and its sounds, it needs ATP. In order for the jellyfish to contract its umbrella, it needs ATP. All cellular components of all living things use ATP as their immediate fuel, as their immediate source of energy. Even plants, in order to perform photosynthesis, they use ATP as well. They use the sun to make ATP, and then ATP is used to make the sugar. All living things, that's why we call it universal and energy currency, because it's the form of chemical energy that is produced from respiration to be used for the cell's energy requiring processes. So when glucose is broken down aerobically and forms carbon dioxide and water, the body, the cells, is actually using the energy that was originally in glucose to produce ATP. Then the ATP goes into the cells and provides the energy that those cellular components need. So ATP is a chemical. So what happens to it when it gets used by the cell? What happens to ATP, for example, when it gets used by that active transport pump? Well, the ATP that is produced by the cell during respiration, when used by cellular components, it gets broken down. the ATP gets broken down into two parts, ADP and a single phosphate group called PI. Then, during the process of respiration, which occurs continuously inside the cell, the ADP and the individual phosphate, the phosphate inorganic, that is what the I stands for next to the P, get recombined back into ATP. That is the aim of respiration, to take the ADP and the phosphates from the cell, the remnants of used up ATP, and recombine them back together to reform ATP again. Let's go into some detail on the structure of ATP. ATP, known as adenosine triphosphate, is a molecule which looks very similar to a nucleotide. In fact, it is a modified nucleotide. If you remember, a nucleotide is made up of a sugar and a base and a phosphate group. That's a nucleotide. But instead of a single phosphate group, ATP has 3 phosphate groups, not 1. And that makes this nucleotide ATP. The sugar is always ribose and the base is always adenine. And that is the structure, the molecular structure of an ATP molecule. Now, what happens when ATP gets used up? The bonds that have most energy are the bonds between the phosphate groups. The bonds between the phosphate groups are quite energetic because they are unstable. So the ATP very quickly in a chemical reaction would break those bonds. And those bonds are very weak because every phosphate group is negatively charged. So they repel each other. In any case, the bonds are quite unstable, they're very energetic, and once one of those two bonds gets hydrolyzed or gets broken, then the energy stored in the ATP is given off, and it's given off to the molecule that requires that energy. So when ATP gets used up, it splits one of those two bonds, it hydrolyzes one of those two high energy bonds and forms adenosine diphosphate, ADP, ATP with 2 phosphates instead of 3, and a single phosphate group called phosphate inorganic. Those two parts are the remnants of used up ATP, and in the process of respiration, the phosphate inorganic, the PIs, and the ADPs are recombined. The reaction in which ATP is used up is called ATP hydrolysis. Hydrolysis reactions, if you remember, are those reactions in which bonds are broken using water. The energy given off by ATP hydrolysis, as we have already said, is used by the component which needs energy. So when ATP, for example, binds to that active transport pump, the active transport pump breaks ATP down into ADP and PI, and it can perform its pumping action. During respiration, the energy released from the food is then used to recombine the phosphate and the ATP back together. During respiration, the energy released from food is used by the cell to recombine ADP and PI. Remember that the I stands for inorganic because the phosphate in that form is not combined with the rest of the ATP, and ATP is produced again. The process of respiration is quite long. If you go into all the details, it is a very complex chemical dance of many different molecules. At intermediate level, we need to know the name of each stage and what each stage does in a general way. So we're not going to go into the detailed structures of all the molecules and all the names of all the molecules involved in the 20 or so reactions of respiration. There are many reactions, more than 20 in fact, but we are going to see an overview of the respiration process, and we are dealing with aerobic respiration here, all right? Not anaerobic respiration. We will talk about anaerobic respiration at a later stage in a different lesson. So respiration can occur in the presence of oxygen or not in the presence of oxygen. In this case of this lesson, we will focus on aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration is the kind of respiration that is performed in all the cells that have two conditions, that have mitochondria, or at least one mitochondrion, and oxygen available. If aerobic respiration is performed, then the process of respiration goes through 5 stages, or 5 sets of reactions. These are glycolysis, the link reaction, the Krebs cycle, the electron transport chain, and finally, oxidative phosphorylation. So these are the 5 stages in that order that process the food to ultimately produce ATP using its energy. We will start with the process of glycolysis. But before we go into the details of glycolysis, it's important to note where these processes occur within the cell. Glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell. So there are no organelles involved in the process of glycolysis. The first stage of respiration therefore occurs in the cytoplasm. But from stage 2 through stage 5, all those chemical processes occur inside the mitochondrion, a mitochondrion or many mitochondria. Almost all eukaryotic cells contain mitochondria. Therefore, this process that we're going to describe today occurs in pretty much all eukaryotic cells of all organisms on Earth. Let's start with glycolysis. Glycolysis is a 10-reaction metabolic pathway. When we say metabolic pathway, we mean a series of chemical reactions in which a chemical gets changed into another, and then into another, and then into another, and so on. Every reaction in the process of respiration is catalyzed by enzymes, of course, but we will not go into the names of these enzymes. It starts off the process of glycolysis with glucose and ends up by splitting it apart. This occurs during the 10-reaction process. The split up glucose is finally 2 molecules called pyruvate each. So a glucose molecule, which is a 6-carbon sugar, gets broken during the process of glycolysis into 2 molecules of pyruvate, which of course have 3 carbon atoms each. The breakage of that bond between the 2 carbon atoms in the middle, the breakage of the splitting up of bonds in the glucose, and then the formation of pyruvate used to produce energy-carrying molecules. Not only of ATP. ATP is produced by glycolysis, but not only. Some energy, instead of being used to make further ATP, is used instead to make a different energy-carrying molecule called NADH. Now, ATP is the universal energy currency of the cell. NADH is not. So NADH isn't the molecule that carries energy within the cell. What it can do, NADH, is provide energy to the mitochondrion in a later stage in order to produce even more ATP. So its energy can be tapped in by the mitochondrion in order to produce even more ATP in one of the stages subsequent to the glycolytic process. When we say glycolytic process, we mean glycolysis, of course. So glycolysis is the splitting of glucose into 2 pyruvate molecules with the with the additional formation of energy-rich molecules ATP and NADH. If you're curious what NADH stands for, its full name would be reduced nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. I don't think that at intermediate level it will be expected of you to remember this name, but it's good to know. The link reaction is the second stage after glycolysis. Now, the link reaction will only occur if oxygen is present and if the cell possesses a mitochondrion. If the cell is not aerobic, then this reaction does not occur. The link reaction occurs in the mitochondrial matrix. That is the space within the mitochondria. In fact, now we will take a break from the process to see the detailed structure of a mitochondrion. This is an image, a photomicrograph of a mitochondrion as seen under the electron microscope. Mitochondrion is a double-membraned organelle, so that's an organelle with two membranes, and it happens to be that the outer membrane of the mitochondrion is quite smooth, it has a smooth surface, whereas the membrane on the inside, the inner mitochondrial membrane, is much more folded. It has a greater surface area. The space between the inner and the outer mitochondrial membranes is called the intermembrane space. The intermembrane space has a very important role when it comes to the functioning of the mitochondrion, as we shall see later. On the inside, that's the mitochondrial matrix, the space in which the link reaction and indeed also the other reactions which will follow the link reaction occur inside this organelle. The folds of the inner mitochondrial membrane are sometimes called mitochondrial cristae. In any case, so pyruvate, the product of glycolysis, the first reaction of respiration, is imported into the mitochondrial matrix if there is a mitochondrion in the first place and if the cell has oxygen. Once inside the mitochondrial matrix, pyruvate undergoes the link reaction. The link reaction is quite simple. It looks straightforward, at least on paper, because it's a single chemical reaction. Pyruvate is a 3-carbon molecule. In the link reaction, one of those 3-carbon molecules gets detached from the rest of the molecule. In fact, we say that one of the carbon atoms of pyruvate is oxidized and forms carbon dioxide. This is the first carbon dioxide produced during respiration. If you recall, whenever we write down the word equation for respiration, it's glucose plus oxygen produces carbon dioxide and water. This is the carbon dioxide. This is one of the carbon dioxide that gets produced, and then we write down in that equation. Besides carbon dioxide, the link reaction also releases energy, but in the form of NADH. No ATP is produced directly from the link reaction, but remember that NADH will later be used to form more ATP. Pyruvate, when it gets oxidized, when it gets broken down in the link reaction, and one of the carbons gets oxidized as carbon dioxide, it leaves a 2-carbon molecule called an acetyl group. The acetyl molecule is a 2-carbon group that cannot really exist on its own. It has to bond to another molecule, which then carries it to the next stage, to stage 3. And this helper molecule or carrier molecule is called coenzyme A. So what we write down in the equations is acetyl-CoA, which is short for coenzyme A. Coenzyme A would already be inside the mitochondrial matrix for the link reaction to occur. So it's not something that was part of glucose or that was part of pyruvate. It's found inside the mitochondrial matrix waiting for the link reaction to occur, and once you get the acetyl group from pyruvate, the coenzyme A bonds to it. Then the coenzyme A takes the acetyl group, which is the remaining part of glucose, into the next stage, stage 3, that's the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle is a pathway, a very important pathway of reactions which occur inside the mitochondrial matrix as well. It is an 8 chemical reaction process. And the interesting thing about the Krebs cycle is that the first product formed gets reformed by the end of it. So it's a cyclic type of reaction. The intermediates or the products of each reactions are not important for us studying biology intermediate, but what we need to know is what the aim of the Krebs cycle is. The aim of the Krebs cycle is to completely oxidize or to completely break down the remaining fuel, the remaining carbons of glucose, the acetyl group, fully oxidized into carbon dioxide. When this happens, of course, energy is released, and the energy is released in the form of both ATP and NADH. Indeed, a single cycle of the Krebs cycle produces a net amount of 2 molecules of ATP, 3 molecules of NADH, a molecule of ATP, and some other molecules as well, which we don't have to go into all that for now. So the point is this: the acetyl group, which is the remaining part of glucose, gets fully oxidized in the Krebs cycle, and all the remaining energy found in it is used to produce further NADH and ATP. The ATP can be used directly by the cell, but the NADH, not just the NADH produced by the Krebs cycle, but also the NADH produced by the link reaction and by the glycolysis, this NADH needs to be converted into a form, it needs to be used to produce energy in order to produce ATP. Now, this is the job of the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain is different from the previous stages because it's not simply a series of chemical reactions occurring there inside the mitochondrial matrix. The electron transport chain is a series of reactions which occur on the inner mitochondrial membrane. The inner mitochondrial membrane is that highly folded second membrane of the mitochondrion, and it is chock full of membrane proteins, which I drew in purple. The membrane proteins inside the inner mitochondrial membrane together are called the electron transport chain. To be precise, every electron transport chain is a set of 4 proteins which would be found next to each other on the inner mitochondrial membrane. There would be many electron transport chains in one mitochondrion, and each chain would be composed of 4 electron carriers. That is the name that we use for these proteins, electron carriers. Electron carriers are so called because, as we shall see, their job is to carry electrons. In a very literal sense, they act as a wire. They conduct electric current, really. And in so doing, they use the energy of NADH. And this energy will be finally, at stage 5, used to make further ATP. Now, we will go into the detail of exactly how the electron transport chain works in the next lesson, because this lesson has been already quite detailed, so we will focus on the electron transport chain and how it uses the NADH, to create energy, which will ultimately be used to make ATP in the next lesson.